Morning and welcome. Welcome to those of you in the room with us and also those of you joining us online. My name is Matthew Simmons. If you're wondering, it's Monday, 10 a.m. and we are here to launch the Foresight Africa report, a report written by the Brookings Institution. The structure of the day is that we're going to have an introduction to the report by Aloysius Udu. Aloysius is a senior fellow and director of the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institute. And then we're going to follow up with a discussion with the panel. I'll introduce the panel once we're done with the overview of the report. But we've got a great panel to discuss this report, and then we'll take questions from the audience here in the room, but also those of you who are joining us online. Please do send us through your thoughts, comments, and questions, and we'll do our best to integrate those into the discussion as well. So with that, my name is Matthew Simmons. I'm the Executive Director for Economic Research Southern Africa, and I'll hand over to Aloysius to do the introduction and presentation.
Thank you very much, Matthew. This is on? Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you, and welcome to all of you, and those listening online, welcome to this presentation. As Matthew mentioned, my name is Aloysius Uche Odu. I should be in Nigeria right now voting, but I chose to be here, and I'm glad that you are also able to join us here today. Thank you very much for coming. Firstly, there are really a number of people I need to thank for this opportunity, because I've been going around the region and Eastern Africa, where I'd launched in Nairobi, in Dar es Salaam, and last week in Gaborone, and then here today. This was really made possible because of Gracelyn, who's actually a fellow at AGI at Brookings, and then of course Matthew and the entire team. I'd like to really thank all of you for making it possible. I believe this will be the first time, Matthew, I'm sure, that we're launching Foresight in Pretoria. Sure. Okay, so thank you for making that happen. And there are many panelists, a couple of panelists that Matthew will introduce later. I think there are other things you could have been doing, but you chose to come and join us today. Thank you very much in advance to the panelists. So let me say a few words about the Africa Growth Initiative itself at Brookings. In terms of our governance structure, we do have a distinguished team of advisors. So people like Professor Njuguna, who used to be Central Bank Governor of Kenya, who's now Finance Minister. We have people like Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, WTO, who used to be Finance Minister of Nigeria and who worked with us at the World Bank for many years. So those are about 7 of them are the distinguished advisory fellows who basically oversee what we do. And I'm also delighted that Professor Harun Bora from Cape Town DPRU is also with us today online. And Harun is a very senior fellow at non-resident senior fellow at the Africa Growth Initiative. So we have people like that across the continent. And we also have about 22 think tank partners across Africa. And of course, one of the purposes of my visit here today is also to discuss with Matthew and the team the possibility of a partnership between AGI and ERSA. I'm going to get it right? So thank you very much for that. AGI at Brookings. Basically, the best way to remember AGI is that we do 3 things. High quality authoritative research is obviously comes with the territory of the Brookings Institution, the oldest think tank in the world. 1916 it was set up. So that's one thing we do. The second thing we do is really that we help basically to build the capacity of think tanks across the African continent. As I mentioned, there are 22 of them, partners of ours right now. And we do that through collaborative work, right? So we fundraise jointly, we co-create concept notes, we then develop research pieces and work together. They bring the on-the-ground knowledge and data, et cetera, and local knowledge as well. We bring the independence of Brookings, quality assurance, peer reviewing. So it becomes a very, very important mix when you have the North-South together. And so that is a function we take very, very seriously, the capacity building of think tank partners. And of course, we too get capacitated by our partners because there are many, many things we learn from them. So it goes both ways. And then the third thing we do is really raising African voices. Raising African voices is very, very important to us. Rarely do leaders come through the nation's capital in Washington without coming to Brookings to give a keynote address. We're very, very proud of that. Most people actually request. They say, we're coming to Washington, can we come in? So it's something we take pride in. Policymakers, every annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank, people know that of the think tanks around Washington, the place to go really is usually Brookings. Last annual meeting, for example, we had 2 central bank governors and 2 finance ministers on our platform to have a conversation about how the continent is battling with the multiple headwinds we face in today's world. So the finance minister of Botswana was there, Peggy Ntuli from Zimbabwe, we had the central bank governor of Uganda and the central bank governor of Ghana. And it was really, really important conversation. So we take pride in that. And before that, when Biden-Harris invited African heads of states for the Africa-US summit, we had President Masisi give a keynote. Before that, we had President Hichilema give a keynote. So basically, raising African voices is paramount in terms of our functions. And then youths, we do a lot of work on youths. And we've been working with think tanks and youths to help Africa's youths sharpen their narrative on climate change. And we took a couple of youths to COP27 in Egypt recently. So we take pride in really escalating African voices. Of course, living in Washington, the number of times I've lost count where I go to Congress, Senate, House committees to testify. Any bills they're debating involving Africa, they reach out to us to come and talk about those. So that's really what we do. And of course, Foresight itself, talking of raising African voices, the report we're about to launch today, there are 63 authors in that report. So if you can imagine the number of African voices, writing the essays, writing the viewpoints, and of course, we're very, very proud of that. Even more proud that 50% of the authors are women, and it doesn't happen by accident. So we really make sure that the presidents, policymakers, captains of industry, youths, women's groups, you name it, scholars, and think tank partners are all authors of this report. So that's about the report. But the world we live in today, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things about that before we go into the report itself. Because when I look back in history, the closest time for many of us in the room, hopefully, who were born in the 70s, the closest time I can think of in today's world was actually the early 70s in terms of the parallel. Because those of you who were born then around 72, 73, 74, you know that the world had heightened inflation. The type, what we're talking about today, 9%, I mean, this was really very high inflation in the 70s. Interest rates, the US interest rates in the early 70s were about 20%, and the stock market collapsed. OPEC just flexed its muscle, and energy insecurity was unleashed across the world. That was the type of world we had in the early 70s. That was pervasive geopolitical tensions. Does that ring a bell today? So these are some of the parallels with the early 70s. Of course, debt was a major deal, debt overhang in Latin America. And for Africa, my former employers in London, the Economist Intelligence Unit, basically ruled out the continent as a lost continent around that time. And of course, that was subsequently followed by 3 solid decades of slow growth across Africa. And then when you think of the fact that COVID is not gone away yet, so when you put all these things together, we realize that, as I mentioned, the closest to today is really in so many ways was the world of the early 70s. This slide basically, earlier in January, the World Economic Forum, this slide sort of sums up today's world in a way, in this picture from the World Economic Forum. And attendees were asked, what's your outlook for the global economy in the next 2 years? And if you look at the top line there, I'm sorry that the picture is not very clear for those at the back, you find that in answering that question, a staggering 82% of respondents saw progressive tipping points, persistent crises, volatility, and multiple shocks. The same group of people were asked, look ahead 10 years from now, what's your outlook in general about the world economy? Only 9% saw renewed stability in 10 years. The balance saw periods of insecurity, uncertainty, heightened economic risks, climate shocks, more geopolitical tensions, and COVID not completely gone. Don't take my word for it. That's what the attendees at the World Economic Forum, that was their response to those questions. Then that leaves us with, so what's the prospect for our continent, for the African continent? Here, of course, it's very, very easy to be pessimistic about Africa's prospect, especially for those of us who live in the nation's capital in Washington. It's very easy to be pessimistic about Africa's prospect. The gloom and doom is easier to predict than prosperity. And yet, time and time again, Africa has proved resilient despite all the odds facing the continent. We saw that during the Ebola crisis. We thought that Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia were going to be completely decimated. In fact, tourism in South Africa was impacted during the Ebola crisis because the average American didn't want to go anywhere near, right? Anywhere near Africa because it's one place, remember. But anyway, so basically the continent recovered. When HIV/AIDS hit, and this region in particular as well as the rest, everybody thought, that's it, Africa is going to be decimated. It didn't happen. And then, of course, came COVID. When COVID-19 hit, the prediction was, my God, how can they do social distancing, So it's all really very difficult to be, not to be pessimistic. But then I'm reminded of my countrywoman. Many of you may have read Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who reminded us of basically the need to be conscious of the danger of a single story. Because Africa is not one place. Despite all the headwinds, the IMF, the World Bank, my former institution as well, the African Development Bank, all these entities, including the economists, all project growth of 3 to 3.5% on the continent, which is not considering all the naysayers, right? The only challenge, of course, is that countries like the middle-sized countries, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Congo DRC, Tanzania, etc., are going to carry the giant share of that growth. They will be growing at 5 to 7% in the year ahead. On the other hand, the heavyweights, South Africa, my own country, Nigeria, Egypt, will record very, very slow growth this year. So it's important, therefore, to underscore that on balance, basically African policymakers are not helpless. I think it's important to emphasize that because at the end of the day, domestic policies matter. They matter a great deal. And if there was ever a time when domestic policies are so critical in facing these multiple headwinds, it is now. Because the idea that Russia invades Ukraine and then Africans are starving because of food insecurity, it just doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense because, Winston Churchill was on record as stating that the last thing you want to do is to waste an opportunity. This is the time to grow food and grow food in abundance. This is a time to eat local varieties. They're actually healthier for us than reliance on wheat, etc. So rising food prices present opportunities to grow more, and there are many, many other ways that we can demonstrate that our policymakers are not helpless. And in this slide, last time we confronted food, fuel, and financial crisis, if you remember, was in 2008, 2009. And at that time too, I remember I was VP at the African Development Bank at the time, and accompanying my boss, Nono Kaberuka, to London to the G8. It was G8 then, it's G7 now, right? But anyway, so the G8, G20, they were all on record, asking the IMF, the World Bank, regional banks to act counter-cyclically. And so that was the way we fought that triple F of food, fuel, and financial crisis during that period. And we thought we'd never seen anything like it, the Great Recession, as it was called. And even Botswana, I remember that, over a period of 3 weeks, I sent a team to Botswana to prepare $1 billion loan to Botswana. They had never borrowed from the ADB in those days. They borrowed 300 from the World Bank, borrowed 1 billion from the African Development Bank. They didn't need it, but they just wanted to show up more reserves in case commodity prices tumbled. So that was the world we were in. And the way policymakers on our continent responded to that Great Recession was basically to borrow their way out of it. Because if you look at that picture, you see that interest rates were just completely zero. And so it was easy to borrow. And that's what countries did. But today, we have so many things happening. You have interest rate, the graph, the picture I just showed, you see how it shot up. You have, at the same time, inflationary tendencies and pressures. The European Central Bank, the Fed in the United States, all raising interest rates. So we have the idea that countries who were already highly indebted, when you combine the rising interest rates, the ability to settle international financial obligations are really, really tough right now for many, many African countries. Next door, we all know what has happened in Zambia, Ghana, next. And when you look at the debt situation of many, many countries on the continent, it doesn't look good. And that's because of, the high interest rate, and of course, currency collapse, etc. So now more than ever, I think the deal is very clear. Our policymakers must use domestic resource mobilization as the way out, because not many countries are actually in a position to borrow more. So it's frightening, therefore, when you look at, on average, sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of domestic resource mobilization, is 16.5% of their GDP. It goes from about 28, Mauritius, etc., to about 6.5 in the case of Nigeria and Central African Republic. The rest are just around that. South Africa is higher, 20-something%, I think, the last time I checked. So this is not the way to go, because not many countries have developed, to the best of our knowledge, in East Asia and Europe, elsewhere, Latin America, without raising about 30% of their revenues and domestically. That kind of self-reliance is important to underpin development spending. So we believe very strongly that now more than ever, domestic resource mobilization is a big deal, and countries should pay more attention to that. The second is really that now more than ever, our policymakers have to really use development financing much more wisely than we've done in the past. The idea that, monies are supposed to be used for the purposes intended, and that's not happening. There are many, many countries, without naming and shaming. Now is the time to really minimize the risk of leakages and really use development resources, whether domestically generated or borrowed money, because the women, the children, and men of our continent, their fate relies on how we effectively spend these development resources. So those are some of the things that in terms of the world we live in and how Africa is not an island, in terms, so to speak. So it's within that this sort of global environment that we set out to draft Foresight Africa 2023. This is a flagship report we've done since 2011. Every year, we basically approach, as I mentioned, presidents, policymakers, scholars, etc., to crowdsource, if you like, essays and viewpoints of their thinking on what's ahead for the continent. Usually it's about 6 chapters, but this year we made it 7 because of the critical nature of food insecurity following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So basically what you will find when you read the report is in chapter 1 that you know, we're talking about tackling the multiple headwinds that African countries face at this time. And so Professor Njuguna, who's a senior non-resident fellow, just like Harun as well, basically Victoria Kwakwa, who is the World Bank's vice president for this part of the world, Nicholas Kazadi of Congo DRC finance minister, and the CEO Ade Ayeyemi of the EcoBank group. These are people and many others in this chapter. And basically the message is very, very clear that Africa's policymakers are not helpless, as I mentioned earlier. Domestic policies matter and the time to act is now. And therefore countries should do everything they can to basically minimize waste and take advantage of the crisis. In chapter 2, you find food security. And there again, as I mentioned earlier, it's very, very painful that Russia invades Ukraine and then Africans are starving. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, the Indians came up with the idea of the Green Revolution. And the magic of the Green Revolution is very simple. You know, you have improved varieties of planting material, seeds. You have use of fertilizer, herbicides, etc. You have irrigation water when the farmer needs it, not when the government supplies it. And then you have extension services, agronomic services. When you combine these things, these 4 things, that's the magic of Green Revolution. So you have Orissa, I mean, you have Haryana, Punjab, West UP, and Tamil Nadu with rice and wheat yields of over 7 tons. And then you have some of the Gangetic states that didn't quite see the revolution, you know, languishing at about 3 kilograms, per hectare, etc. But you come to the African continent, what first hits you is the number of green areas across the continent that have seen no revolution whatsoever. What we have been doing is extending farming space and therefore cutting down on forest in order to expand agriculture, when in fact, the rest of the world is agricultural intensification, using inputs much more intensively. And so, in a nutshell, the continent has no business being food insecure. Zimbabwe alone, in boarding school in rural Nigeria, we used to learn that Zimbabwe alone could feed the entire continent. And yet, Russia invades Ukraine, and all of a sudden, Africans are starving. So it shouldn't happen, and our policymakers really need to gear up on that. And so in that chapter, the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Haile Mariam, many of you may know him, Ahuna is the Director for Africa at the UNDP, Janine Cooper is the Agriculture Minister in Liberia, and Satu Santana is the Managing Director at the IFAD in Rome, and many, many others opine on what needs to be done. And in a nutshell, agricultural systems we need to focus on. And locally, you go to Uganda and you talk of food insecurity, they don't know what you're talking about. Because for them, matoke rules the waves and they eat local varieties. So they're not in any way impacted. So we need to really go back to local varieties. We need to really trade, move areas where productivity is high and take advantage of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area to make sure that we can do basically the continent as a whole is fine. Education and skills is a chapter we didn't really have in previous Foresight. But when we were launching Foresight last year across the board, and as we will do today, ask you, are there some things you believe we've missed, some things you believe should be more important to be included? That's how we factor and include in subsequent Foresights. So education came out of such launches last year. And this is particularly a painful graph because it basically shows that school completion rates are highly unequal across the continent. In fact, during my visit to Gaborone last week, it coincided with the announcement, the release of the high school results. A high school, I don't know if I should be publicizing this, but the success rate was under 40%. And across the continent, there are now many, many 10-year-olds who can't really understand a simple essay they've read. And the idea that these will be tomorrow's teachers, it sort of makes you wonder where we're headed. So basically, education and skills is a big deal. And policymakers were saying basically, and COVID, of course, we lost a lot of grounds, particularly girls in many parts of West Africa. Many young girls who became pregnant couldn't go back to school. By law, in the case of Tanzania, the previous president. So there are really, really challenges in terms of preparing our young people for the skills of tomorrow. And so we asked His Excellency President Kikwete, the former president of Tanzania, to pen an opening opening essay in that chapter. And I'll really, really encourage you to read that chapter, because what he had to say, I believe that policymakers across the continent ought to pay attention. David Senge, many of you may know, is the education minister for Liberia. Ruth Kagea was the former director. Actually, she was former director of Southern Africa, when we were all at the World Bank, and subsequently she went home and was a senior advisor to President Kenyatta of Kenya. And so they basically point out some of the things, the way, again, using public resources, paying attention to primary and secondary education, and of course, particularly for our young girls, STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and maths, where we really, really are falling behind. On health, basically, COVID, as we mentioned, is not completely slaughtered as such. It's still there. And this picture is very interesting because it shows that on the continent, healthcare spending in Africa in the last decade, whether domestically financed or with borrowed money from donors, healthcare spending has consistently gone down, as you can see. And yet, this same continent, our heads of states in Abuja in 2001, signed the Abuja Declaration where they said, you need to spend 15% of your budget on health. It never happened. But of course, when COVID hit, everybody was spending almost 90% of their budget on health. You can't do that, right? Because you need to really spend to be prepared and preventative. And so this is also important. And another thing raising its ugly head right now during COVID is the danger of forgetting other diseases. HIV/AIDS is not gone. There are more young people now, basically transmission in some parts of the continent. And malaria and many other diseases, it's very easy to forget them. But the point is that spending on health has not been going in the right direction. And so we have John Kengasson, many of you may know the name, the former CDC, Africa CDC director, who's now head of PEPFAR in the State Department in the US, Winnie Biayima from UNAIDS, Michelle Williams, Dean of Public Health in Harvard, Leah Tadesse, who's the Minister for Health in Ethiopia, and Chikwe, the former Nigerian director of CDC, who's now in Berlin. And so these guys basically answer the question in this particular chapter of what our policymakers should do. And again, the message is very clear. The systemic approach is the way to go, and more attention to prevention, because it's too late when it's already happened. This is one of those slides in the chapter on gender, which I always find very, very interesting to say the least. It says there basically that Africa's female political representation is above the world average, right? So the idea, therefore, that we declare victory is a myth, because we're a long way in terms of gender equality on the continent. So some countries bias this because you have Rwanda, where a lot of women in parliament, etc. But generally, we're way, 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 way off where we should be in terms of the gender justice. And so we ask quite a few people to advise policymakers on the continent. And the idea of addressing gender disparity, you find what they have to say. We have a lot to do. Government, civil society, donor partners, etc. There's just so much to do in terms of the gender. So people like Jenny Klogman, who used to be director of gender and at the World Bank, now a non-resident fellow with us in AGI. Karen is also with us in Brookings. Sina Lawson is the gender digital economy minister for Togo. And Malabo Kaba is the ADB's director for gender. They all in basically speaking the same language, the idea of making sure we continue this fight in terms of gender equity. On climate change, what is there to say? This picture says it all. This is a continent at the extreme right, which contributed least to the problems we have today. But the consequences are far greater on our continent than elsewhere. When I was growing up in geography, we used to learn that as you come from the north, you have the Sahara Desert. Beyond the Sahara, you have the savannah. Beyond the savannah, then you come to those of us towards the coast. Right now, you go to that same geography, there is no savannah. The Sahara has been unrelentingly the march downwards. And so that is wreaking havoc on the livelihoods of a lot of people. Your neighbors here on the other side, Madagascar, cyclones used to be every 7, 8, 10 years. Now it's frequent. Northern Mozambique, you go to the Horn of Africa, livestock and livelihoods are destroyed because of climate change. And here we are, those who cause the problems are still arguing, 100 billion is taking an eternity to actually materialize in the funding. In the meantime, most of the solutions are actually on our continent. The second largest lung of the planet is in the Congo DRC. And, after the Amazon, that's going to rescue us. Some of the rare earth minerals that we need for the transition, most of them are found in Africa. And yet, the consequences are greater here. So that is clearly, we need to do far much more in the next COP28 as we go forward. So here we, again, assemble people like Kevin Orama, VP at the African Development Bank, John Mulligan, the director of the Gold Council in London, Gracelyn here, a non-resident fellow, Mahmoud Mohadin, who was managing director at the World Bank, and now the Egyptian special envoy, and many of you may know Honorable Bogolo from Botswana. And I will encourage you to read the chapter and what they have to say. And then final chapter is on cities. Here too, we are really confronted with some serious challenges. Of the 1,900 cities in the world, with over 300,000 people, 176 of those are in Africa. Fast forward 20, 30 years from now, Africa will be $2.6 billion. A majority of the cities with over 300,000, in fact, 2/3 of them in 20 years will be in Africa. Where would we all live? And so the challenge is enormous for the continent. And here we have contrasting essays, the Jide Sanwo-Olu, who's the governor of Lagos, and a city with 25 million people. We're asking, how are you coping now when most parts of Lagos will actually be underwater in the next 15 years? I don't know whether he wants me to say that, but it's a fact, right? You go to the coastline of West Africa, Dakar, all the way. Most of those areas will be underwater. And then his essay contrasts with Peter Nyong'o, the governor of Kisumu. I think most of you will know the name Nyong'o because he's the famous father of Lupita. And so they talk about the challenges of running a secondary city versus running a mega city like Lagos. And we also asked the mayor of Cape Town, George Hill Lewis, who all of you know, to talk about how Cape Town coped with water. You know, I mean, I said coped, but it's still a big challenge, as you all know. So I'll encourage you very much to read that chapter. And so these 7 chapters make up basically what we have in this year's Foresight. And it'd be great to really, as we go around the continent and launch, what we try to do is to look at the Foresight through the prism of the region we're in or the countries we're in. And so with the help of Matthew now, we have assembled for you a great and esteemed panel so we can discuss some of these issues. Thank you very, very much for listening. Thank you.
Join Aloysius at the front. Just quickly introduce the panelists to the room and the online audience. On my left is Mamakete Lijani. Mamakete is the chairperson at Economic Research Southern Africa and is also an analyst in financial markets and fixed income sales trader and a macro strategist. Does quite a lot of work in terms of commentating and contributing to the national debate about economic policy. On my right is Gracelyn Baskaran. Gracelyn is a consultant in the Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions Group at the World Bank. And she's also a resident associate with Brookings, non-resident associate with Brookings. On Gracelyn's right is Will Pearson. Will is a senior investment advisor at Prosper Africa, which is managed by USAID. And he's an author with experience in energy, infrastructure, and impact investment sectors. Aloysius, before I hand over, let me also just introduce Haroon Borat, who is online and will be providing the closing comments to the workshop. So Professor Borat is the director at DPRU UCT and is a senior fellow at the Brookings Africa Growth Initiative.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And a warm welcome to our panelists, please. Thank you. All right, thank you. And those of you online, please sharpen your questions. I'll do the first round of questions and we come to you in the room, then those online, and time allowing, we have additional questions. Perhaps it's good to start with you, Mamakete. Thank you very much for making the time to be here. Coming into 2023, South Africa, as if the country doesn't already have enough problems, you know, that many economic challenges entering the new year. And now recently we hear it's been, you know, gray listed by the Financial Action Task Force. I was just wondering your own thoughts of what this additional challenge makes for the policymakers in the country in terms of how they should respond to these challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of those things amongst the many, like you said, a very challenging environment and all the things that we're trying to process. It's kind of like the next sort of building block to our own little mini instability. I found it interesting, actually, the chart that you started off with that shows the perceptions around uncertainty, etc., going forward. And I think this speaks to that. I think we're in a region and on a continent that has got a lot of multiple things that is trying to deal with, one of which is, you know, instability around crime, terrorism, etc. And this is reflective of that. As South Africa has become more open and you've had more people coming in, the challenges have become more pronounced relative to what it would have been, say, 20 to 30 years ago. You know, the need to be more proactive around that has risen. even as our own governance infrastructure has deteriorated. So to my mind, the grey listing is a reflection of the facts. It's not in and of itself a challenge. It's just a scoring of where you are. And what it means is you have to be responsive to those challenges. You would have had to be anyway, but maybe what it does is it makes it clear that this is where you are, and maybe this is something that needs to be addressed. So in terms of how the country then responds and what the impact of that will be, you know, I think from a policy perspective and a legislative perspective, there was a lot of activity towards the end of the year last year and into the early part of this year to try and plug those holes. But the real challenge is around enforcement, and that becomes much harder to deal with predictably in this political context. So my sense is, you know, in the bigger scheme of things, given everything else that's going on, this is probably not the worst thing that is happening to South Africa. Yeah, so you know, if I had to like rank in terms of intensity and things that I worry about, it's there and thereabouts, but it's not the top thing. I think we all know what the top thing is. But it does highlight that there are deficiencies, unfortunately. And it doesn't feel to me that it's something that can be resolved quickly.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say. And then the fact, though, that the two biggest economies on the continent were grey listed on the same day. Yeah. Do you see any implications for the continent as a whole?
I think it's a very difficult one to kind of answer because obviously there are implications in the immediacy of it. It's like, oh, you've got all this enhanced oversight, etc., and possible erosion of confidence, and you increase the hurdle rates around investments and all of those things. But I think far more than that, it just signals that we live in a restive continent, and maybe that's what it says, is that security issues are always have to be, you know, top of mind for people who live on this continent. It's always subject to a lot of uncertainty, a lot of movement of people, a fair amount, more than what we would like to acknowledge and accept, of criminal type of activity. And this is where we are. And if it was going to happen anywhere on the continent, where else but South Africa and Nigeria, where the financial flows actually are? So I think it's just indicative of where we are. It's not, you just have to accept it from that perspective. But, you know, policy-wise, whether you can be responsive, it's really difficult to tell right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Matthew, as we discussed, we mentioned earlier, rising interest rates, inflationary pressure, etc., countries' ability to settle international financial obligations, debts rising higher than you imagine. You have the added difficulty in South Africa that contingent liabilities of ESCOM has now been piled on to the state. You know, in this sort of situation, what advice would you give the policymakers at home here about how best to manage all these debt crises?
So on debt and public finances, I tend to be relatively old school, which is increasingly controversial, something I don't understand. But I tend to believe that you need to be able to pay your way, and you need to be able to sustain that over an extended period of time. I think that debt is a very important developmental instrument in terms of where there are credible growth prospects that the state needs to take advantage of, also in terms of managing crisis and countercyclical flow. But ultimately, the fundamental financial sustainability of the state is non-negotiable, and it is an important. It's an absolute constraint on future service delivery. Whatever you undertake to do, however you want to do it, you need to have the means in order to pay for it. Otherwise, you're really just dreaming. In terms of South Africa, I think that, you know, we've gotten ourselves into a situation where the the vision of the state and the obligations that come out of that vision of the state are no longer commensurate with the economic potential of the economy. So there is a structural, unsustainable deficit in my estimation of things, which is going to be extremely difficult and is going to require a kind of whole of government solution. The dynamics at which this work is that if you find yourself in that kind of situation, well, you can cut spending, you can raise taxes, or you can grow the economy. And we seem to have kind of given up on growth. The narrative is about how can we borrow more. There are other people pushing back by saying you need to cut, and there are other people pushing back by saying you need to raise taxes. Even if all of these things are feasible without significant social and economic dislocation, which I believe they aren't, why are we not prioritizing and focusing much, much more significantly on addressing growth problems? And the growth problems in this country are pretty well diagnosed. They're pretty well understood up to a certain level. I mean, I would love to spend the whole day discussing this with you, but I don't think we would learn much more than what we already know. The barriers to growth have been worked on for a number of years and are relatively well understood. And what needs to be done about them needs to be well understood. When I started working at doing stuff for ERSA, I would also always kind of sign off by saying, and it's been X number of years of load shedding and counting. I think that was at 11, you know, and it's still, we're now in 15 years of load shedding and counting. What one does about it is not something we need to discuss in very much more detail. How one goes about doing it and doing it responsibly and in as short a period of time is something that is worth discussing. I think that just, you know, quickly, you had an excellent graph. I mean, the measure of a report is probably, can you capture it in a few graphs that you can summarize on a presentation? And I think that this report really lends itself to that. But you had a graph showing international interest rates and how that may have affected borrowing in Africa. It certainly affected borrowing in South Africa. And the reversal of that trend is something that is going to be a very serious challenge confronting South Africa. It also brings, you know, we need to research what is the role that South Africa plays in international capital markets, because the impact it has on South Africa is going to be very different from the impact it has on Malawi or Zambia. And then, you know, you've mentioned the issue of fiscal risks. Certainly, this is something, you know, when I was in the budget office, we were aware of fiscal risks. We were saying we need to talk about it, but it was more of a process. It was something we weren't terribly worried about. We're now getting to see what it is that fiscal risks can actually do to the profile of your public finances and just how hard it is to manage these things when contingent liabilities start to realize themselves. And in that bracket, I would also put non-traditional borrowing. And I think that is especially true for the rest of Africa as well. South Africa at this point does have very good access to capital markets, and so haven't had to look into non-traditional borrowing. But then the last thing is the emergence of climate financing. What is this actually going to deliver, and how are we going to make sure that we have the absorptive capacity to use that money in a responsible and effective way to enhance future opportunities?
Right. Thank you very much. Roslyn, turning to you in your brilliant essay, which, by the way, I encourage you all to read in the chapter on climate change. You talk about the consequences of climate change, slowing growth, you know, eroding and rolling back decades of development gains. Remember Africa Rising narrative, all that is eroding now. And of course, deteriorating public finances. So, Finance Minister of Nigeria, what would your advice to me be? You never know, I could be in the new administration.
So I think there's three public finance challenges we have to look at, right? So one of them is just the increased expenditure to respond and the deteriorating fiscal capacity to respond. You know, every time you have a drought, you have a flood, you have a cyclone. I mean, we have Cyclone Freddy hurling towards us in Southern Africa right now. You have to spend. The second area is you have slow growth, right? We see particularly in places like Madagascar that you end up having tourism stunted, agriculture stunted. So you see that slowed growth. And the third thing, you know, we've talked a lot about this, is you have increasing sovereign downgrades on the continent, and you have, you know, credit rating agencies like Fitch saying, well, we are going to take water scarcity or, you know, high flood risk into our, you know, our ratings discussions. And the problem with that is there is that high exposure. We've seen climate change be mentioned in the context of downgrades in Namibia and Zambia in the last 3 years, which means that the borrowing you need to respond to climate change is also going to become more expensive, and or you may not be able to access it. So the question then becomes like, what do we do about it? So I would say the first thing is, how do you leverage new financing instruments? So one of the things we look at a lot, for example, is sovereign insurance. So if, you know, you have this catastrophic shock, you know, a 1 in 20, a 1 in 50, a 1 in 100 year event, you know, you want to have this insurance that pays out because you don't have the fiscal capacity to respond to it. You know, a second one we're looking at more in South Africa is agriculture insurance. You know, every time we have a shock, farmers take a huge hit. It affects food security, it affects livelihoods. So what is the extent that we can roll out agriculture insurance to reduce that income hit? And then the third instrument that we have in South Africa, which is our contingency funds, we often find, for example, in the case of Day Zero in Cape Town, is when these events happen that those reserves have already been depleted. So a recommendation there would be, how do you earmark funds for climate change such that they can't be depleted by, you know, state-owned enterprise bailouts, by public sector wages, because when the shocks happen, you don't have that there. The second area would be improving the efficiency of existing expenditures. You know, in South Africa, we have huge allocations coming in the next 3 years for infrastructure, but we're building and rebuilding that same infrastructure over and over again because it's not done in a climate resilient way. So that makes it an inefficient, wasteful expenditure. And then the final area would be monitoring your liabilities. You know, we saw during COVID-19 that we needed to put these social, you know, grants into place. Yes. But those are things that you have to factor into when you have a climate shock, is how are you monitoring what your liabilities are for something like the agriculture sector, for something like infrastructure, and monitoring those becomes really important because that's how you manage fiscal risk. You know, you have to keep that into consideration. So those are, I would say, the three recommendations that need to be taken into account as we see increasing frequency and severity of climate shocks.
Interesting. Sticking to climate still, Will, in the recent December last year, the Biden-Harris administration invited African heads of states and governments to the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. One of the outcomes was the MOU that the U.S. government signed to support Zambia, next door here, and Congo DRC, right, in their goal of building EV battery manufacturing facilities in the coming year. So from your point of view as an energy specialist from where you sit here, what is the U.S. doing exactly to support these kinds of initiatives in those two countries and other countries?
Sure. I'll just give a very quick background on Prosper Africa in case some of you in the audience aren't familiar. So Prosper Africa is kind of a whole of government initiative, started during the Trump administration, but embraced by the Biden administration, that I think is really trying to take a more coordinated effort at how the United States approaches investment in growth opportunities in Africa. Obviously, the U.S. has been quite engaged on the continent over the last several decades, but you can point at initiatives like PEPFAR or the Obama administration Power Africa programs that have been indicative of the U.S. here. But I think what's become clear is the U.S. could be doing a lot more. And I think Prosper Africa is trying to harness what the U.S. can offer across 17 different government agencies and programs. To get to the question, climate change is kind of underpinning a lot of various up and down value chains. And so climate change, I think, is an area where my own team is very focused, but we're also partnered with other U.S. government agencies, whether it's the Development Finance Corporation, whether it's USAID, whether it's Department of Energy. And I think that it's an area where we're trying to build on some of the successes of what we've seen in the recent past. Some of these include in areas like Power Africa, where a lot of renewable energy infrastructure has been invested in over the last decade. I think quite interestingly, this MOU that you're mentioning about EV batteries, I think it's a great signal of intent. And obviously what the US is doing here is we're supporting countries.
Okay.
Zambia and ERSA first had an MOU that they want to move in this direction because of their endowment of natural resources relevant for the e-mobility sector. There's a lot that has to be done, not just in Zambia and DRC, where there's a lot of policy issues. Zambia very much still in a debt crisis, some positive signals, but it's a slow process to come out of that, as we're seeing there. And that's a very interesting topic of conversation we can take on later. But it's also creating demand for e-mobility. And we see a lot of investments across the region, especially here in South Africa, but exciting e-mobility projects in Malawi, Zambia, just all around the region, where you got to create that demand to make an EV processing facility viable. So to finish, I would just say, as Prosper Africa, we're looking at certain sectors as certainly strategic. And I think climate finance underpins a lot of this. In certain areas, we were talking earlier about critical minerals. I think we are working in partnership with companies and governments here on the continent that want not just for new mining investments to take place, but for new mining investments along the whole value chain to take place. So we're looking at infrastructure, we're looking at processing and refining capabilities, and we're looking to support entrepreneurs that are driving demand for some of these products. So I like the story of this MOU, because again, I think it's getting into, a very important sector for meeting climate change challenges. But B, there's a lot of things that need to happen. And we're looking at the specific projects that we can support investment into that can make MOUs like this come to fruition.
Thank you. Thank you. You guys have been very patient. Just checking. Does anybody have a quick question for our panelists before the second round? Yeah, over there, the gentleman. Could you make sure there's a question mark at the end of it?
Consulting to JJ at the moment.
Yes.
The question is, and I maybe what you're saying about how you do things is worthwhile discussion, because I appreciate the information because a lot is said about what. And so and what you mentioned in the beginning, the why, because there are crises and this inequality. So the how part really deals with the skills that is required to execute on all of the what, which is really the knowledge that is gathered. And to execute, you really need, because we're involved in a lot of, it's an interdependency there.
Yes.
For everyone to be working together. And so the question is, how do you get more granular data on the what that can inform the how to implement initiatives? Because you're not going to use the same what in Nigeria as opposed to Malawi and Zambia for the context of it. So how do you get the granular relevant information to inform the how, which is the real skill on how you execute on the initiatives. So that if your foresight in the launching of this of the Foresight Africa to monitor, because you need that granular data to monitor the execution to then say the crisis that was the why we do that can be monitored over time. So that's my question. I think it was a question mark at the end of time.
This is specific to you, Matthew. So your thoughts.
I mean, Anthony, just because you put a question mark at it, the end doesn't actually make it a question. I mean, I think mainly it was a useful comment and contribution. And if people were struggling to hear it online, I guess in summary, Anthony is asking, how do you start to develop data that influences and shapes policy, especially given that how countries are experiencing these challenges or failures is very different. And just to really add to the comment or the contribution, I think that is a challenge that we as a research community need to try and respond to. How do we get access to new innovative data sets that give us greater insight, especially on a local and regional level? It's absurd to talk about economic growth in South Africa as 1%. I mean, Cape Town might be growing 3.5%. Grahamstown is doing something very different. And the policies of promoting growth regionally is something that is very different. But I don't want to suggest that there isn't important stuff we couldn't do at a macro level that would help us very significantly. I think that, the climate issue is another great example of how we need to think about data that we produce and how do we make it useful and make an input into policy formation. As I kind of go into that issue, I see an enormous amount of the data and interesting scenarios being generated. There's this kind of flood of quite granular and interesting data, but how is it supposed to go into the policy-making environment? And that is, I think, to dodge your question, Anthony, that is a challenge that we as the research community need to respond to.
Sorry, I see the gentleman in white. Yeah.
Thanks. Jason Naidoo from the University of Pretoria. I just had a quick question for Preston and Will. You mentioned stuff about the importance of agricultural, or you talked about the effects of sort of weather shocks on agricultural markets. And I guess I just want to hear a little bit more about what do you see as evidence that those, I mean, it's not like there's no agricultural insurance markets and stuff. I can't speak about other countries in the country. So what do you see as the signs that particular interventions are needed in those markets?
Yeah.
Perfect. So in South Africa, almost all agriculture is for commercial farmers, and it's generally a multi-peril insurance, right? So that's going to cover your flood, your hail, but we don't have insurance at the small and medium. And part of that is it's very expensive. And South Africa at this point is one of the only countries in the world where that's not subsidized by the government, right? And the argument is that subsidizing the insurance is cheaper than responding to every shock. I mean, we've seen how many droughts and national states of disaster have been declared for it. But what we do see is in a lot of countries, it has been done well. You see Zambia has it now, India has it. So what we see is that if subsidized and if the investments are made in data, because agriculture insurance requires a lot of data, whether you have satellite-based or area yield, you need the data. So the government puts in the data and they subsidize it. The private sector comes in, they design the insurance in a way that becomes locally relevant, and then they carry the risk, right? So what you're essentially doing is saying, I'm going to pay your premiums, which is a very fiscally contained endeavor. And then the risk is transferred to the private sector such that there is a payout. And to support that on a smallholder level, I want your banking details because I want those disbursements paid quickly. Because if left to kind of the government, this can take time. Right? I've got to go in and measure my losses. So the idea is, I think if you bring the public sector and the private sector together, it's been replicated in a number of countries in Asia and Africa, and it works quite well. And it has been a priority. If you go back and read National Treasury's documents for the last 5 years, you will see agriculture insurance repeat itself from both the Treasury side and the Department of Agriculture.
I'll come in with kind of an investment level view that's maybe less on the insurance market, but I think it gets into how can tools, drought resistant seeds, different types of, capabilities for farmers to fight climate change get into the market. And one of the things that I've seen in the decade that I've been focused on Southern Africa is when I came down, I'd been working in the energy sector a lot in the US and Europe. And I came down, I was mostly working on grid connected projects, and I was living in Zambia for 5 years. And the projects that I worked on from 2016 to 2019 are very attractive projects. They're still awaiting financial close because of a macroeconomic challenge, the debt crisis. These projects are standing still right now. Over the last 5 years, I've been doing a lot more work in the off-grid space. And some of these solar home systems companies that you see in places like Malawi and Zambia and Mozambique, one of the things I find fascinating with, again, it's more like a fintech application, is essentially a lot of these customers, they don't have bank accounts, small scale farmers, no credit history, and there's a credit industry. So a lot of times what's happening is you're building credit history through first a small solar home system, and then through paying on a monthly basis, you build up a credit history. And then what some of these companies are doing is they're cross-selling into agricultural products. And I've seen a few examples of this across sub-Saharan Africa, where you're starting to get these tools that I mentioned earlier, different types of seed products and irrigation tools to farmers by building up that credit basis. So I just wanted to point that out too. I think it's an interesting technology story as fintechs applied to different types of industries. You're getting creative ways to meet climate challenges.
Margot, is it possible to see whether there's any online question? Sorry?
No questions yet.
None yet. Okay, let's continue here. Please sharpen your questions for our panelists. Coming back to you, Amakete, the point on education, right? Educational outcomes on our continent. Various contributors, as I mentioned in Foresight, bemoan what is happening in terms of closing the gender gap in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. From your viewpoint, what should our policymakers in this region be doing to encourage more young women and girls to pursue careers in STEM?
I think the chart that you showed when you were having this particular discussion is like, it's just hard. It's one of the most heartbreaking charts I've seen in a long time. But also it's very reflective of the reality that, girls are struggling to go to school. Never mind, or to finish school, never mind whether they're doing STEM or otherwise. Right. So if I think about it, the whole STEM discussion as it's happening in the global north, for instance, has got to be women in STEM, I think has got to be quite distinct to the one that we have in the global south in general, and in our region in particular. When I talk about that, I'm like, if I think about what the challenges are for women in this region, it's not about whether, professors are discriminatory or, there are very few women in senior roles in STEM, etc. It's really about the girls managing to go to school and to finish school. And I think it speaks to what the policy challenges are in this region specifically, and it's really very much about the rest of the policy mix. So when government fails to deliver services, so it can be basic services like water, it can be energy, etc. In that gap, women fill the gap. So if you don't have access to water in the village, it's the girls that have to go walk to get the water. That means their ability to finish school, to participate fully in school is curtailed. If there's no electricity, they are the ones that have to fetch firewood. So they fill the gap for the service delivery challenges, I think, in the region. And I think if you go back to the chart that you were showing, it might explain why girls in South Africa have finishing rates that are as close as those of the boys relative to the other countries in the sample. So I think at the heart of it is to recognize that the failure to deliver services or the consequences of the failure to deliver services are carried disproportionately by women and girls and communities. And the next layer is around social services. So that's social support. If the healthcare system is not working, if there are no primary or early childhood development centers, then none of these things. It's the women that have to fill the gap. If there's no hospitals or the healthcare system is not working appropriately, women have got to fill the gap. So the failure to deliver healthcare and other social services is again disproportionately borne, or the consequences are disproportionately borne by girls and women. The other thing I think is around reproductive health. So, reproductive health, if you don't have good reproductive health, and this is not just providing necessarily birth control, but things like sanitary care, etc., it becomes a drag on women's ability or young girls' ability to attain an education. So the policy responses are much more, I think, are much wider in that sense. Then there's the issue of, overall societal, gender inequality. And I think that that gets addressed in various ways: early marriage, and all of these things, interestingly, are related, because if you're a man and you can't get XYZ, you don't have a washing machine or whatever, the first thing you want to do is get a wife, and so these girls get married. Girls get married quite quickly as well, so they don't finish their education. And generally speaking, then the expectation is not that they do finish their education. So this is something I'm particularly passionate about, and I think that comes through. I can say tons about it, but I think on the whole, if the government doesn't do it, women do it, and you've got to do. It becomes a much more intractable problem, I think, but also one that I think should be more easier to kind of think about. And then when it comes to STEM careers, once girls are actually in school and they're in higher learning, etc., and they finish primary education and they finish secondary education, I think there, the problems are as they are worldwide, and probably a lot less in this region, in my experience, than they would be in like Western countries. So in my experience, once you're at university, etc., girls do as well as boys, but they need to finish school.
Thank you very much. So we're already in February, end of February already. In your view, in your infinite wisdom, will 2023 be the year that South Africa can recoup lost grounds and return to the path pre-pandemic growth? And it's a loaded question, because it'd be interesting for you to also think through what I say 2 or 3 main risks to growth prospects in this region as a whole.
Yeah, it's an interesting phrasing of the question. What are the kind of, could South Africa rediscover its growth potential, and what are the risks to growth?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it feels to me like it's actually the other way around. What are the risks that South Africa might actually grow? Yeah. The baseline is currently so significantly set, and I think it feels like there's so much confidence in that baseline. What would it take to kind of shake that up and introduce something else? It's so passé to say, and I've been saying it for years. Without electricity, there's simply no growth for an economy like this. We can talk about any number of other initiatives, stimulative on the demand side or other things on the supply side. If you're not going to be able to power those initiatives, then they're just leakages and waste associated with all of that. So we've got to get on top of that. And it's it's very difficult to think about what, in fact, I can't see how we think about growth prospects without substantively getting a handle on how we are going to power economic activity and do so in a responsible, sustainable way. Moving from that, there's a lot of infrastructure that has depreciated very rapidly, either through lack of maintenance, maybe through criminal activity, and that continues in bad management, perhaps. That is the next very large binding structural constraint that has to be confronted, especially around the transport environment, the ports, the roads, the railways. That's all about finding your feet, getting ourselves standing again after whatever has happened to us in the last 10 years. How do we then start to move forward and go forward? So the getting firms to invest, getting investment to take place is what has to be the next step. Putting that basic transport infrastructure in place will be very important in terms of enabling that. There is a great infrastructure or investment opportunity around the kind of new green economy and new electricity provision, but there's still a very strong base to the South African economy in mining, agriculture, and manufacturing that is dependent on both electricity and transport infrastructure. Once private sector investment starts to pick up again, we have a human capital constraint. We are going to need people to operate those businesses as they emerge. And on this, I look a lot at the immigration side. I think that it's a fallacy to say we are producing engineering graduates that are going to deliver on these business operations and investments. Businesses are built and run by graduates with experience. So it's not enough to say that we've got X number of engineering graduates. We can have a prohibitive immigration regime. What you need is 35-year-old engineers. And we've got work that shows that that is where the employment multiplier lives. If you bring in an engineer with 35 years worth of experience, you create 15 to 25 jobs in a very conservative estimate. So that's sort of how I look at the big macroeconomics of this. Once you've done that, there are definitely a number of micro, but also demand and supply side issues that need to be thought through. But we got to first stand back up and begin to move forward. The last kind of thing I would say on this is more of a, maybe it's not terribly helpful. It's a little more philosophical, but you know, we need to change our relationship with private sector profitability. Private sector profitability is actually a public good. Profitable companies pay tax, they invest, they employ people, and they employ people formally within your labor regime. If a company is profitable, they are not doing something wrong. It's probably not because they're doing something wrong. It is in fact something we should be welcome and should be encouraging. So as we move hopefully into a high growth path, it's about addressing those 3 or 4 large things. There are going to be many other things we will have to debate and discuss. But I think philosophically, a relationship with the private sector and private sector profitability, which is a little different from how we currently are relating to private sector investment and profitability.
Thank you. Sticking to climate change, Gracelyn, I think COP27, Africa's COP, didn't really deliver for Africa. So for our policymakers, how do we actually make sure that the countries of the North, who are accountable for a large share of this problem, meet their climate financing pledges. And while you're at it, COP28 is next November. How differently should we as African policymakers prepare for that?
Those are $1 million questions. So I think the first thing is countries are often negotiating independently. And I think there is really that need to take a continental approach. We really saw, for example, the Alliance of Small States has made some progress, but it's because they've worked as a unit of countries that could identify priority needs. We have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which we've talked a lot about. But the question is, again, as a bloc, how do you negotiate for your needs rather than saying, well, I have this risk and I have that risk? So I think that's the first thing is if you take 54 countries, your negotiation power goes up substantially. The second thing when we think about damages and losses is the damage and losses on the continent are massive, right? We have high drought areas, we have cyclones, we have floods, we have everything in between. The question is, how do we create a larger risk pool? Again, you'll find that I come back to this a lot, to leverage market-based instruments, right? So for example, if I take a country like Malawi, you're gonna have a very hard time getting insurance in Malawi. The risk pool is too small. But if I aggregate enough countries, I open up my risk pool enough to make it much more appealing to the market to take that on. And then the question is, how do we negotiate for wealthier countries in the global north to pay for our instruments? And it's a much stronger case to them because they're saying, okay, well, we're going to pay this much. And then the risk is transferred to insurers and then reinsurers. And it becomes appealing to those, like we said, because you have those economies of scale. The next area I would say is, how do you strengthen resilience to climate change? Because if, again, damages and losses, if I have to fund every year, every second year, every third year, these damages and losses, countries in the global north start to kind of become quite defensive of, well, we have our own needs. But when you sit and you read debt sustainability frameworks in your free time, by the way, done by the IMF, you see that very few countries are actually building into their long-term financing plan for adaptation. For example, how do I put seawalls up in areas where I have flooding? How do I put in climate resilient infrastructure practices, solar irrigation in areas where I know I have a lot of droughts? So part of that is being able, again, as a continent, to go to the global north and saying, well, look, if we put in these climate resilient measures, then can we actually reduce our long-term recovery and reconstruction costs? And very intuitively, the answer is yes. We were talking about this the other day, but when we talk about financing from multilateral development banks, it's almost like the higher your debt levels, the cheaper the financing, or the free, right? We have a lot of grant financing that comes in. But it's saying if you build climate resilience in as an incentive to get, lower concessional loans or grants, that's a really good incentive in the long term to reduce debt. Because we know, for example, I'm thinking about the 2015-16 El Nino in Eswatini, it cost 7% of GDP, 19% of expenditure that year. And I can tell you the majority of damage still remained unfunded. So if you actually met the need, it would be much larger. So in the context of thinking about fiscal austerity, debt consolidation, all these things we value from a global north financing perspective, all very important things. It's how do the countries in the global north, how do multilateral development banks incentivize that? And then how do we transfer that cost to them through donors, through these various the private sector? And overall, I think this becomes a much more sustainable approach. So it's really, I think the heart of it is going to COP28 and saying, how do we negotiate this as a continent rather than as 54 countries who need support?
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me that of the three countries or three big continents or subcontinents, when something is happening at the UN, China is represented by one person, India, similar population represented by one person, Africa, similar population represented by 55 countries. It's very difficult, huh? Represent 55 people. All of a sudden, how do you really, this notion, even going to the US Africa Summit, you always wish for that day when our leaders would actually have a pre-meeting before the main meeting, right? To basically get a sense of what are the one or two things we're going to ask. As the American will say, what's the ask? Of course, we know what happened in Sochi. They all went and signed military deals. But anyway, so we do have challenges in terms of these numbers. But back to you, Will. The unprecedented times here, which Matthew talked about in terms of power shortages in South Africa and in the neighboring countries. What for SADC as a whole, what do policymakers need to do to mitigate these shortages of electricity in the region?
It is interesting, just some of the threads of the conversation and how there's two kind of battling themes. And on the one hand, for a lot of Americans, I think, and this is something we do through hosting delegations from institutional investors to come over here, is to understand that different countries have different risk profiles, right? And that's helpful, and getting investment into the country. But on the other hand, I think it's important, and look at the energy sector specifically, to really look at regional markets. And then we've got the Africa-wide free trade agreement. So on the other hand, it's also, while it's important to understand, the various sovereign factors that go into any individual country and why they might make an investment case or not. I think a lot of investors also want there to be tighter linkages for the country so you can justify an investment. Link back to the EV factory in Zambia or DRC. That's really challenging right now if you don't have seamless trade into the region. And right now, you can look at 60-kilometer queues, to get out of Zambia and into Southern Africa, into other countries in Southern Africa. So I think I see a lot of promise in regional integration, and there's recent, again, signals that within SADC, you can start solving some of the energy crisis through better trade of electrons among different countries. And I think of Zambia, again, having lived there for 5 years, they have their own power shortages there. It can end after you get a few good rains. Then once the dams start filling up, load shedding goes away for another 9 months until the next drought or whatever it is. But you can get a lot more investment in hydropower in the northern part of SADC, and that can be a massive battery then for all the solar and wind that can be built elsewhere. And for refining processes and things like that, if you want to look at Namibia, massive rare earths capabilities there to drive a lot of the digital or clean energy transformation, they need power. They need good supply of power. And I think SADC, the tools that are in SADC are already there. It's just really putting them into practice to start really convincing investors that you can build large energy projects in one country, and you can really depend on the free trade of those electrons to get to where it's needed. So I do think more work is needed. I think some of the there's a company in Zambia called Africa Green Co. that's really looking at becoming a trader of power in the region. Copperbelt Energy Corporation is another company up there that has that membership into SADC and can trade throughout the region. What you haven't seen yet is that to transform into a real belief, and you need the infrastructure investments. You need better interconnections and things like that. So I do think SADC and just regional mechanisms like that can play a big role in using the technologies that exist and then getting the power to where it's needed, instead of each country fighting their own battle to ensure that they can avoid load shedding. It's really taking a regional approach, and you can get better economies of scale. So the tools are starting to be there, but I think there still isn't comfort or the infrastructure needed for that to become a reality just yet. But maybe these crises, especially in a country like South Africa, that is such a big economy, can really drive more comfort into these mechanisms.
Right. Margot, any online? Okay, you guys have been very patient. Any question, comment? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm from the University of Pretoria. So to try and maybe put a more positive spin on this, because this question with a lot of negativity, but if we can just get to the point in terms of, there's a lot of suggestions to problems, and none of these problems are particularly new.
No.
They've been around for ages. If we go back 20 years, there would have been suggestions on how to deal with problems. 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So can we point to some real world examples where problems existed, recommendations was given, it was successfully implemented, to, in a sense, provide a bit of a blueprint going forward. Right, this is possible. And we're not going to sit here next year, this time, rehashing this with different language.
Right.
So are there any particular examples we can point to, success stories that almost give a bit of motivation to the economies and the people out there. We're all feeling a bit like boiled frogs at the moment, realizing we're about to get cooked, every year just seemingly gets worse. Give us something positive. Where are the successful?
I thought I was the optimist here, but here's one, right? So,
Well, I go back to technology. And I'll stick with the energy sector. But 10, 15 years ago, if you look at IEA projections of where solar penetration would be today, I think it would be miles off, right? And just the pace at how quickly costs have declined for both batteries and solar panels have fallen, have made a reality of both solar home systems in rural parts of Africa, but also, and it raises a different question, commercial industrial applications of on-site power generation for big corporations. One thing I was fascinated by when I was at the Indaba a few weeks ago, I worked on a program that was funded by the German government when I was in Zambia, and a lot of companies from South Africa, but all over anybody that was investing in Africa was coming to Zambia because there was confidence that these projects would happen. And so many of the project developers that I knew that were interested in on-grid power at that time were all at the Indaba doing commercial industrial power, looking for mines, typically as one of the big A-list type companies that you could sell to. So I think that there's these solutions, and I think whether you're looking at health technology, health tech, education tech, some of the hard technologies, whether it's the solar home system company I was talking about, or just the existence of batteries and solar panels and things like that, that a company can turn to lower their dependence on the grid, you are seeing the private sector adopt these. Now, it doesn't address all the questions that exist, right? I think especially in Southern Africa and especially South Africa, in some ways, this technology is going to places that can afford to embrace the technology and the customers. And I think this is a big topic of conversation is I think more and more companies will go off the grid. And I think it raises the question of what happens to utilities that are then going to be serving residential end users and things like that have a reduced ability to pay. But I think I would just go back to the technology and the changes that we've seen over the last 10 years, that they are commercially viable in a big way, and you're seeing more and more companies embrace them. You've seen large investments in the C&I space in South Africa.
Can I just say also I'm pretty optimistic on energy, actually. Not in the short term, but in the medium to long term. I think the amount of capacity that is currently being invested in, generation capacity off grid, so away from ESCOM, away from the stories that we concentrate on, is quite large. I think the last estimate that I saw was that there's like 6,000 kilowatt hour of electricity that's going to be coming on stream in the next 2 to 6 years. So already that means you have the prospect that in year 2 or 3, you probably will have much more reduced load shedding. The problem, though, that I think we're going to stay with is around the costs, and the costs with respect to the normal grid or the ESCOM grid, so to speak, because also the less power ESCOM delivers, the more the higher their cost per kilowatt hour is going to be for them to generate. The challenges around that are going to persist. So in terms of anybody who's still using the grid, those costs and et cetera, the inflationary aspect of that will persist. But I think the actual availability of power itself, we've had enough reforms on the legislative side. There are enough plans. It makes enough financial sense. And the forecast that I've seen say you probably will not be sitting with this, at least the availability of power. You might have a cost issue at some point, but not availability.
So I think, Will, you had your hands or something?
Sure. I mean, just to, so I think there are a number of interesting case studies, and it's time to revisit some of those case studies, given our current perspective. I think Argentina and the reforms that they operationalized successfully in Argentina is something I would like to know more about. The collapse of the Nigerian grid in, I think, 1996, and this micro generation model that has driven their growth, but with very large environmental costs. I would like to understand that. I would like to understand, does solar really offer a much lower environmental footprint than so many other things when you take into account what it takes to manufacture batteries and the charge life cycle? There's actually I found a really interesting chapter in this report on Nigeria as a self-organizing state. Anti-fragile state. And that was something that gave me some hope. But it's an intuitive analysis, and how we as formal researchers would begin to work that out is, I think, something quite interesting. But sure, is it true that that electricity supply and distribution has shifted from being a natural monopoly where you have to rely on the state and state agencies to something much, much more diffuse? I think would be a really, really useful development, and it happens with technology, as Will says.
Grayson, a sense of optimism for a change?
I have optimism. It's just tucked away some days. So I think there's 2 points of optimism for me. So one is COVID-19 was like a wake-up call to shocks as a whole, right? No country on earth was truly prepared to respond to a large-scale shock. And if you look at countries, even in Southern Africa, I mean, 3 of 5 SACU countries are now developing risk layering strategies to how do you use risk retention instruments and risk transfer instruments to manage future climate shocks. We've seen a huge appetite for agriculture insurance, not just in South Africa, but Lesotho, Namibia. So there's this recognition that you cannot manage the future of climate change through your budget, as there's less and less budget space, quite frankly. So that's an exciting point to me, is that there is this appetite. If we look at Kenya, they have successfully adopted shock responsive safety nets, right? So that when a shock happens, you have these automatic disbursements, and it came with financial inclusion because you had to get a bank account for that. So we have seen these bits of quite progressive policies and appetite from countries to manage that. I think the second thing I would say, I'm also a big renewable energy nerd. And if you look at a country like Namibia, they have more sun than almost any part of the world, right? I mean, they are a desert. I don't know if you've ever been, but it is a desert. And there's this huge appetite now for building out these large scale renewable energy. And it's very attractive to the private sector in a way, right? Because they could export to the entire rest of the region with how much they have, and the revenue would be of significant added value to Namibia. So it's saying, how do you bring together essentially the private sector for the investment, put in the infrastructure that's required, which I'm sure Will knows far better than I, but then can turn around and be a long-term generator of revenue and alleviate this kind of power constraint in the region through, again, regional integration through the power pool, right? So I think what we're starting to see, if you look at renewable energy investments in Africa, I think 75% of them have been concentrated in Egypt, Morocco, South Africa, and Kenya. But we're starting to say, look, you're widening energy inequality, but there's so much potential to add these other countries in and develop a more robust environment. To me, that's an area of immense excitement because it's regional integration, it's addressing energy insecurity, it brings in the private sector. So there's a lot there to be hopeful about.
Makote, Matthew, Gracelyn, Will, thank you all. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Round of applause. Thank you very much. Over to you, Matt. Harun,
Yeah.
Okay.
Lucius.
Hi, Harun. Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I just wanted to check if I'm good to go. I can't see or hear too well.
You're good to go.
All right, thanks very much. I guess a sign of aging and location is that you are asked to provide ceremonial comments at the end. And so I'll do the same as requested, but of course can't help myself with just a few reflections on what I've heard. I mean, it strikes me as really important for I'm guessing a predominantly South African audience to realize and appreciate the central role that AGI does play on the continent. I think it's often under-recognized, particularly as we tend to be South Africa-centric, as we should be, but just the recognition for the hard work that Lucius and team do in Washington to raise the profile. And it's not just the US Congress, but also the World Bank and the IMF to raise the profile of African voices in particular. So rather than simply listening to, let's call it Western observers writing or thinking about sub-Saharan Africa, I think what the AGI does is, almost as a natural way of doing business, promote and work with Africans to talk about sub-Saharan Africa. So I think that for me is actually fundamentally important. So even if you look at this panel and you look at the release of the report, there's no question in my mind that the report represents an ongoing, if you think of foresight over the years, look at the foresight for the last few years and you'll see voices and authors that perhaps you haven't heard of simply because they come from the continent. Okay, so two substantive points which I think are really, really important. One is the short run, which Alicia's picked up on, and I just want that as a thread before we move to closure, and that is the rise and the specter, if you like, of sovereign debt. And so the idea that we've got a global supply chain constraints from COVID-19, which then raises the inflationary bogey in the Western world primarily, then leads to a sudden uptick in interest rates, has a fundamentally important impact on sub-Saharan Africa. And so what we're seeing with high inflation and with the strengthened dollar is that debt servicing costs for many African economies have sharply risen. And next to the appreciating dollar is the fact that you've got food or net food importing African economies that are suddenly finding food imports becoming far more expensive. So what I think is really important to emphasize, and I'm sure there's a Foresight article, I have to go and look at it a bit more closely, which picks up on this, is that debt conditions in sub-Saharan Africa are likely to worsen considerably as interest rates have shifted globally into an upward cycle. So you've got increased debt servicing costs, which are reinforced by the stronger dollar. So dollar-denominated debt becomes even more expensive to service. And I don't think the rate of growth that we're seeing in sub-Saharan African economies, even though they're higher than most other developing countries, are actually going to obviate that challenge. So in fact, in some cases, you've got interest payments that are projected to exceed 50% of total revenue in some economies. Next to that is, I think, again, so let's just land a little bit on the debt dynamics. There's recent work done by Farah and Yaqub for the IMF, which, and I'm just reading here, they conclude that from a sample of 131 defaults, right? So sovereign debt defaults. So remember, if we're in this high sort of sovereign debt crash point for African economies, you've got the risk of defaults. But their work is really interesting. They find that on average, sovereign defaults cause an economy to fall behind by a cumulative 8.4% gap relative to a control group, which would be countries that didn't experience sovereign debt defaults. In addition, poverty levels relative to the control group increase by an average of 30%. So effectively, what you've got is an 8 to 9% relative to the control group reduction in growth rates for defaulting countries. And so they, in fact, go to defaulting countries such as Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Niger, and Zambia, and they find that in their model estimates, economic growth declined by between 20 and 40% in the decade following a debt default. So I'll just repeat that. In those economies, economic growth declines by 20 to 40% in the decade following debt default. So in other words, you've got this long run effect from debt defaults. And we know, whether it's Zambia, whether it's Ghana, these are pressure points for these economies. And so let's not forget the long run economic growth effects. The second key thing, apart from the growth contraction and the poverty increases that the literature shows you get from sovereign debt defaults, is that the nature of debt dynamics have changed fundamentally. And one key characteristic for that is there are new creditors on the block, right? So over the last 30 years, what you've seen is non-Paris Club governments are now sitting as creditors. They're quasi-sovereign entities, they're state-owned enterprises, and there are a whole series of these new creditors that were never around. And they're sitting there as potentially really important players in resolving Africa's debt challenges that have come to the fore. And of course, key amongst them is China. So the IMF, for example, shows that China accounted for 0.4% of debt stocks in low and middle income countries. But by 2019, that number has gone up to 5%. In some countries, particularly in Africa, China is the key creditor. And so there's a whole series of questions about how these new creditors sitting on the other side of the table next to the traditional creditors, the IMF and the World Bank, are willing to if you like, resolve debt challenges in sub-Saharan African economies in manners, in ways that the IMF and the World Bank are used to, whether it's moderate haircuts, whether it's not seizing assets and so on. So I think there's a whole series of questions there. And then just finally, just to conclude, I think we cannot have a discussion about the region without talking about the industrialization challenge. And the fact that we haven't seen, at least based on the work we've done, we haven't really seen a manufacturing renaissance in sub-Saharan Africa. And so there, I guess, I come out as a little bit of a pessimist, but certainly some of the modeling work we've done shows that the Roderick story of premature deindustrialization still holds for sub-Saharan Africa. And we are in a period where either it's high productivity services sectors or sort of reversion to a manufacturing-led growth path is where we have to start thinking about long-run development. But at any rate, I want to thank, in particular, Lucius and his team for giving me the opportunity, but also I think for launching the report in South Africa and in this format, because I think it's the Foresight is a really sort of anchor publication that requires further reading, particularly in the Southern African audience. But I will hand over to Lucius to formally close, but I want to thank everybody for participating, and in particular for the panelists, who I think did a really excellent job. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Robert. In a subsequent exchange, we need to launch the digital economy work we just completed. So we need to discuss that bilaterally. But again, thank you all for making the time. I know you're busy people and many other things you could have been doing, but just thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And very big thank you to Matthew and the team, and to the panelists as well, and of course to our team back home, which includes former Christina. So thank you. Have a wonderful day.